All right, let's get more now about the implications of Hillary Clinton's trip to Mexico. And for that, we are joined from Washington by Leonardo Martinez-Diaz of the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Secretary Clinton said yesterday the U.S. shares responsibility for drug violence in Mexico because of the demand for drugs in this country. That represents a major departure in U.S. position. How are her comments being received in Mexico?
I think the overwhelming reaction in Mexico is, finally we have somebody who gets the problem and is willing to actually, spell it out. I think in Mexico, in other countries as well, the perception was always that drugs really is a transnational problem that has both a supply and a demand dimensions to them. And the fact that the Secretary is now putting things in those terms is actually a very welcome development. What people in Mexico will now expect is how can we then move beyond this new kind of rhetoric to actual implementable policies?
The Secretary's visit also comes at a time of growing trade tension between the U.S. and Mexico. So how are those issues likely to be resolved?
Well, they will not be resolved quickly. I think the Obama administration will be reluctant to want to renegotiate NAFTA in the middle of an economic crisis. If that happens, I think the Mexicans will want to open some bits of the treaty themselves, probably agriculture. And so I think the only easy solution out of this, the only solution will be a long one, actually. One that will involve a lot of negotiations, a lot of talks, and it will probably take several years.
Remind us how close the trade ties are between Mexico and the United States.
Well, Mexico exports about 85% of its exports to the U.S., and it imports about between 60 and 70% of its imports from the U.S. So the trade connection is extremely tight.
And I know that Mexico, like the U.S. economy, has suffered in this downturn. Has Mexico tried a stimulus plan similar to what the U.S. is doing?
It has. It has actually announced a 1.5% of GDP stimulus package, which, like our own here in the U.S., involves spending in infrastructure and other kinds of fiscal stimulus at the state and municipal levels.
And when Mexico, which is part of the G20, goes to the meeting that will take place in London, do you think it'll support the U.S. position that more stimulation of economies is what's necessary, not necessarily banking regulation?
Well, I think because the Mexican economy is so closely tied to the U.S., the priority for the Mexican delegation is going to be really how do we start growth again? And I think for that reason they will support the slightly more aggressive U.S. stance, which is going to emphasize stimulus rather than regulation. Regulation is also important, but it's, I think, a secondary concern for the Mexicans at this point.
And just in the few seconds we have left, President Obama will be going to Mexico, so that really brings about 2 back-to-back visits in a very short time. What does that signify to Mexico?
Well, we're going to have actually a lot more visits. The Attorney General and the Secretary for Homeland Security will be going to Mexico. This basically means that Mexico remains one of the United States' most important bilateral relationship. Secondly, that it's a multidimensional relationship. And third, that it's going to require a lot of cooperation, not just between the two governments, but also within the Mexican and the American governments in order to really get policies implemented.
Leonardo Martinez-Diaz, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.